Good morning. My name is Jennifer Mokas, and I'm an assistant professor in the Honors College at Coastal Carolina University, which is located in South Carolina along the coast near Myrtle Beach. And I'll talk a little bit more about that context in just a bit. So today I'm going to be talking about a new and ongoing research project called the Flooded Afterlives Project, which broadly focuses on understanding how repetitive flooding impacts the well-being of people and communities. The design of the project involves undergraduate students in its design and in the data collection. In this talk, I'll first provide an overview of the project, and then I'll be focusing on specific considerations and pedagogical techniques to prepare students to engage with communities in responsible and ethical ways. So it's no secret that human-driven climate change combined with rapid land development has led to more flooding in many coastal regions of the United States. But the southeastern US has been particularly vulnerable, especially as slower moving, wetter hurricanes are becoming more and more frequent. Over the past 5 years, flooding has become an increasingly regular occurrence in Horry County, which is where Myrtle Beach is located. Since 2015, some areas of the county have experienced 5 major flood events despite having no prior history of severe flooding. The first 2 floods that occurred recently in 2015 and 2016 were mostly viewed and framed as unusual events. However, Hurricane Florence in 2018 seemed to be a turning point as residents and communities began to vocally advocate for fair compensation for damages and solutions to the now chronic flooding. I had moved to the area about a month before Florence and quickly became involved. I spent about 2 years, my first 2 years building trust and relationships, going to lots of county council meetings, community meetings, making maps for community members, answering questions, providing references and resources when I could, when I was asked. Over time, 2 things started to emerge. First, although there was a lot of attention on the flooding during the initial crisis, right? So during the flood event, attentions seemed to move on very quickly. And I noticed that the ongoing struggles and realities of people who are flooded out of their homes were largely being ignored or kind of swept out of like the main attentions. And second, residents in flooded communities started voicing a need to document and share their experiences. So that is what the Flooded Afterlives project is about. Documenting things like constantly running outside when it rains to check the water level, not investing in decorating your house because it's going to flood again, sleeping in a warehouse because temporary housing is expensive and limited in a tourist area in the summer. So last spring, so in the spring, I teach a class called Water and Women in the honors program and in the Women's and Gender Studies program. And so last spring, I was working with my students to conduct interviews over Zoom with residents in the Rosewood community, which is a working class neighborhood along the Intercoastal Waterway. And the interviews focused on understanding how people experience and react to repetitive floods. Residents in Rosewood were actively advocating for a buyout program. And so all the interview transcripts were made publicly available and will actually be located in the university's digital repository. So they'll be in the digital commons, so available publicly to any community member that wishes to access them. This spring, students are working in Bucksport, which is a predominantly African-American community who is advocating for flood mitigation instead of a buyout because of the cultural significance of the land and community upon which they live. So the students this semester will be working on a community-led flood map and a community housing assessment to help support the Bucksport community in obtaining funding to rebuild housing for displaced residents. As an honors course and women's and gender studies course, my classes are comprised of students from majors that are across the university. They range from theater to marine science. and with no prior experience in community geography. Last spring in particular was challenging because of COVID-19. Students could choose to be online or in person. And so coming up with a way to work through the research project was particularly required particular creativity. And so this brings me to talking about how we might prepare students to do this work sensitively and ethically, particularly given that I can assume almost no prior experience or knowledge in this field. Okay, so the first quality, so I narrowed it down to 3 main qualities and have some examples of how we get that in the classroom. All of this is sort of my first stab at articulating these things, so I'm definitely open to conversation and feedback about them. So the first quality that I focus on is an understanding of power and positionality, which includes reflecting upon their own positionality. So we talk about building trust, consent, decentering themselves, vulnerability. I have 2 activities that I often do to help them understand the relationship between knowledge production and power, and also how one's social and cultural position influences their perception and reality and how they see the world. And I'm happy to talk more about that. And what I really found useful in this class is actually using the reading assignments and media as kind of meta examples of how to do the work. So for example, in the Water and Women course, our main text is Elizabeth Rush's Rising Dispatches from the New American Shore. And this is a journalistic, ethnographic kind of account of communities in the United States who are dealing with the impacts of climate change now. It's intensely human, but also communicates the science behind climate change, salt marsh ecology, sea level rise, et cetera. So it works really well across all the different disciplines that are in majors that are in the class. And so we discuss that material, but we also talk about how the author goes about building relationships with the people she interviews and how she relates to them. And so it provides an example that they can start to see how she is going about these things and the values that she is embedding within her work. And then that helps them see how they can translate it to the work that they're going to be doing here. The second quality that I try to instill in the students are skills in active listening and empathy. So we do active listening exercises in the classroom. I often build methods training with like content that we are doing in the class. And so we do active listening exercises and also peer interviews. StoryCorps actually has a sort of neat training on doing interviews. But they have a prompt for peer interviews that works really well, where the students, it's one prompt and it says, tell me something about yourself that would surprise me. And they take turns interviewing each other with that prompt and continuing in a conversational interview. And I think it really helps them, one, get to know each other a little bit better. And it also helps them understand how to do a conversational interview and the power of being listened to and sharing something, and why people might share something a little bit more vulnerable to someone that they don't necessarily know very well. I may also at times give them narratives from some of my other research projects and have them practice interpreting what the participant is trying to communicate, to practice an empathetic orientation to interpretation. And we also discuss principles of nonviolent communication. And then the third quality that I focus on is building community within the class. And this helps them bond and feel more comfortable working together and collaborating. Of course, like we do icebreakers in the classroom, usually in the second or third week as they start to settle in. But I've also started to look for opportunities for more informal interactions and non-academic conversation. I always feel a little bit self-conscious that things like that are a waste of time. We're not being serious, but then ends up being really important. This semester, I took a risk and was able to bring both of my classes on an overnight camping trip to a local state park. And so at the state park, some of the students saw their first salt marsh, which is great because we've been reading about them all semester, or their first ghost forest. But also, for many of them, it was the first time they put up a tent or went camping at all, or made pizza over a fire. They saw the sunrise over the beach. And so initially, many of the students, right, were a little bit grumpy or nervous about the trip. But afterwards, they raved about how they bonded as a class. And the in-class discussions since the field trip have been really good. They've been talking a lot, much better. And so I think, students learning, the more comfortable they feel with each other, the better they're going to sort of collaborate and work together when they're doing field work. So having fun can be productive. All right, and then lastly, I'm just going to briefly mention some complications that I'm still kind of wrestling with. The first is the tension between students needing or wanting a defined project, as they often do, and the inherent sort of messiness and uncertainty that comes into play with doing community work, which then leads into the complexity of scheduling blocks of time off campus, and especially when community members will be available. But I have students who are often working in the evenings and on weekends. And then just managing the community expectations and student expectations can get complicated at times. And lastly, the biggest one for me in this occasion is on the rare occasion when students drop the ball in a sort of quote unquote regular class, when a student doesn't do their project or doesn't hand in an assignment or does a half job on it. It's sort of just on them, but there's more at stake here. And so trying to balance the giving them autonomy and space and responsibility with the broader responsibility and expectations of the project. All right, so I'm looking forward to our conversation. There's of course a whole lot more we can talk about all of this, but thank you very much.